Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Welcome back to the Dubliner, one of our favorite places. We thank them for their hospitality. And our guests this week, let us say, are frequent travelers through the Dubliner. Brody Mullins and Luke Mullins. They're graduates of nearby Gonzaga High School, a really important private high school here in Washington, D.C. They're also the authors of a new book, The Wolves of K Street. Subtitle, it's an important one, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. Brody and Luke, good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So, what is the secret history you tell in this book? What's the secret that people will learn?
The secret that we learned, twofold really. One is that companies have tremendous power in Washington today, and that they have no adversaries. Labor unions have no influence, environmental groups have no influence, consumer groups have no influence. So companies are really the only game in town. And so when members of Congress or policymakers make laws or legislation, they're only talking to companies, and companies therefore have tremendous influence on that legislation in ways that helps companies and helps corporate CEOs and doesn't help regular Americans.
But Luke, people say, wait a minute, we have Republicans and Democrats, we see them arguing all the time.
Right.
Is that just for show?
I mean, they are arguing, but you know, for about 4 decades, the sort of parameters of that argument was set in large part by the corporate.
The range of options was heavily influenced by corporations and corporate mentality.
Correct.
And bottom lines.
Correct.
And profits.
Yeah, I mean, we call it sort of this pro-business consensus that was sort of formed, you know, in the late 70s, and really we see kind of falling apart now. But, you know, the debates were all about how low should taxes be, how smart or weak should regulation be, you know, how
there hasn't been a corporate tax increase in my entire lifetime in Washington. It's all about, you know, how we can help companies. You know, another interesting thing about that, though, is it really is bipartisan. There's an establishment in Washington, a pro-business establishment that includes the lobbyists and the fundraisers and members of Congress from both sides. This is not about Republicans helping big business.
Wait a minute. I thought President Trump drained the swamp.
Right.
Well, go ahead.
Trump actually started an era where he's trying to go after big companies and try to rein them in. He actually does represent a bit of a shift from what we've seen, taking power away from companies for the first time. For example, in the 2016 election, Trump came out as against free trade. It's the first time a Republican was against free trade in forever. And what happened next? Hillary Clinton came out against the same trade bill. Now, what's amazing about Hillary Clinton is that those are her husband's free trade policies.
Right.
So, I mean, the Clinton agenda, which is very similar to the corporate agenda for many decades here, you know, helped the establishment, helped corporate America, and Trump has signaled a beginning of the end of that.
But, Luke, to the point of your book, during the Trump era, lobbying didn't lose any steam. Lots of advantages were gained and retained by corporations and expanded. Things happened on their watch that benefited them even while Trump was president.
Yeah, I mean, just to back up, you know, your original question was the secret history. What is the secret history? And, you know, I'll answer that. A lot of our book is about this sort of transition away from this sort of inside smoke-filled room approach to lobbying, right, which really defined the 1970s and prior eras. Our book, to a large degree, is about this evolution from the smoke-filled room to what we now call sort of outside influence lobbying. And basically, the goal there is, instead of trying to influence a member of Congress directly in at a golf course or at a steak dinner, the lobbyists are reaching out directly to their voters, directly to their constituents, in ways that I don't think a lot of voters realize, right? And the whole idea is you want to convince voters to put pressure on their member of Congress for or against something, right? And this second part, this sort of outside influence lobbying, is all done in secret. There are no lobbying disclosure requirements. So we talk about the secret history of lobbying. That's really what we're talking about there.
Right. And you draw a portrait that is consistent with any of the political movies of the 1950s, which is, if you knew the majority leader, you knew the Speaker of the House, and their 2 or 3 top deputies, that's all that you really needed to know to move things in your direction in the Congress of that era. No longer true.
Yeah, that's not true. That's how people think lobbying works, but it's not true for a couple of reasons. One reason is that just the government has changed. The nature of power in Washington has changed. Before Watergate, power was held in Washington by basically 3 people who you just mentioned. You know, the President of the United States, the House Speaker, and the Senate Majority Leader. They would get together sometimes in this very restaurant to hash out deals and make laws, and everyone would just sort of follow them. Also, remember, Democrats controlled Congress for 50 years, so Republicans didn't matter at all. So that is now changing, and it really changed after Watergate. That after Watergate, the American people said, we're fed up with presidents who have all this power. They elected 50 or 100 Watergate era reformers who came in, who changed the way power is held in Washington. They moved power away from the presidency and to Congress, and from the top leaders in Congress to committee chairs and subcommittee chairs and panel chairs. Tommy Boggs, one of the original lobbyists, we quote in the book, saying that after the Watergate era, power was held by so many people in Congress that when he went up to Capitol Hill and said, "Hey, Mr. Chairman," everyone turned around.
Right.
And just to follow up on your point about Trump, one of the interesting things that happened in the Trump era is that we saw a reversal from this sort of outside influence that had really defined the prior 30 years to this kind of throwback back to the smoke-filled room era,
right,
where it was really, if you wanted to influence Trump, you had to get to somebody who had influence with Trump, a handful of people that did. And that was so this broad trend that we show over 40 years really kind of was thrown into reverse during
or
the Trump
you
era.
had to advertise on one particular morning show.
Exactly.
But all to get to one person.
Yes, that was the thing. The audience of one strategy is what it was called.
Right.
Got to get to him. Yes.
And you got to him by advertising on Fox and Friends.
Yes.
Or an occasional other show he might dip into
Might
because
hate
he
watch.
hated it.
Right,
Hate
exactly.
watch.
That was the
Saturday
other-
Night Live or Morning Joe.
Yep. Yeah, and in fact, that's precisely what a lot of these groups were doing. Saturday Night Live, for example, groups would run ads on. Morning Joe, they would as well. And then, of course, Fox News.
This is an important day, I think, to have this conversation, May 16th. And I want to ask you about something. Today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average crossed a threshold of 40,000, a historic threshold. This week, the S&P also hit a record, as did the NASDAQ. Is that a reflection of this last 40 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, corporations have taken our economy and taken our government and fashioned it in a way that helps corporate America. I mean, it's no surprise that right now we have the widest distribution in income inequality than we've ever had, and it's because companies have made rules that help themselves, help CEOs, and don't help the regular guys.
And also today, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, perhaps surprisingly written by Justice Clarence Thomas, upheld the Consumer Protection Bureau, fashioned on the other side of the Great Recession. Attacked relentlessly by corporate interests, conservatives, and others, but it's been preserved. That was like the one thing done after the Great Recession to look out for consumers. That's another aspect of this clash, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the biggest lobbying organization in town and that has ever existed and represents all big companies, has made it their goal to take down this agency. And they had done a fairly successful job of neutering the agency until now, which really reflects sort of a change in power back toward the people, perhaps.
Is that momentary, Luke, or do you think that augurs something that is possibly important? The FTC looks to have a bit more teeth.
Yeah.
Is there a move in this direction?
Well, we're certainly seeing, for example, a Republican Party moving, sort of has become much more populist, right? So you meant antitrust is a great example, right? The idea that there would be a popular movement on the right to break up big companies, now in this case technology companies, really would have been unthinkable about 20 years ago, right? And we are seeing that on the left as well, right? And we really view that as almost a backlash against the extraordinary power that corporate lobbyists have wielded over Washington and helping to sort of drive this inequality that is affecting a lot of these voters.
Add one thing that just happened the other day. The Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is starting an investigation into the tax status of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
What's up with that? Republicans and business are supposed to be on the same team. It's like Nancy Pelosi going after the AFL-CIO.
Right. That would be unusual. File that under. I haven't seen that before.
Yeah.
The two voices you've been listening to, Brody Mullins, Luke Mullins, their book, The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. Stay tuned for segment 2, the Takeout from the Dubliner, in just 1 second.
So much of the counterculture, sort of anti-Vietnam protests really spilled over and became targeted at the corporate sector.
Welcome back to the Takeout. You know, the business of Washington is politics, but the business of Washington is also business, is also lobbying, is also trying to find a mechanistic way to move the political system in your direction. That's what the book by our two authors here this week is really about, The Wolves of K Street, Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. Both Luke Mullins and Brody Mullins were talking in the first segment about this era in the 70s. And I want to read something from page 46 that I think will surprise many of you. You're talking here about how there was an anti-business hostility, there were lots of campus protests, businesses found themselves dealing with public demonstrations. Listen to this, folks. In 1970 and 1971, protesters damaged at least 39 Bank of America branches across the United States using, listen to this, explosive devices at 22 locations and firebombs or arson at another 17. Small bombs were detonated at the corporate headquarters of IBM, Mobil Oil, two of them. Following a speech by an anti-war activist on the campus of the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1971, a mob of students set fire to a nearby Bank of America branch. We are clutching our pearls currently in America about some protests on campus about the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. It's an important story. I'm not suggesting it isn't, but contextually, and this is just corporate protests. This has nothing to do with the much larger anti-war protests of that era, but it speaks to something that I think it is possible we have forgotten or never even knew in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about, our research into that period is so much of the counterculture, sort of anti-Vietnam protests really spilled over and became targeted at the corporate sector, right? There was particularly some companies that were manufacturing munitions and things along those lines, but there was also just sort of a broader protest against corporations in America. And that's something that we sort of forget about that era. One, that it happened, and then two, sort of how extreme it really was and how much, anger was directed.
I mean, think of the social media traffic of one bomb or one act of arson at one bank branch.
Right.
It would be nuts. It would be a week-long thing.
And they're pretty clear about it. I think that protest in California, they quote someone saying, like, this was the biggest capitalist thing we could find, right?
It was one student said, the biggest capitalist thing around. The
Yeah.
Bank of America branch.
Yeah, they were very, very clear about what
and that led to a kind of surge in regulatory action, supervision, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the strengthening of OSHA, the strengthening of other regulatory aspects of Washington that corporations finally said we've had enough of in the late 70s.
Yeah, and that really started in the 1930s, though, with the New Deal.
Yeah.
From the New Deal to the Great Society, from FDR to LBJ, there's obviously a tremendous growth in the size of the federal government, supported by consumers and Americans who wanted cleaner air and safer cars and better roads to drive on. What was amazing to us is that companies actually supported a lot of those regulations also, and so did Republicans. I mean, the EPA signed in law by Richard Nixon, not by some liberal Democrat. So companies and Republicans were behind a lot of these regulations.
this was a populist movement in a lot of ways, this consumer movement that we saw in the 60s.
And then what
70s.
happened?
The economy tanked. In the 1970s, the economy goes down. There is inflation.
Because of oil
there's
shocks.
Stagnation, all that stuff is the Jimmy Carter era. And companies looked around, and all of a sudden, corporate profits evaporated. And once it hit their bottom lines, companies said, well, what's the problem? What do we do about this? And they realized the government was their problem. The regulations were their problem.
And it's even broader than that, right? It's not just that profits were shrinking. It was that among sort of CEOs, they were concerned that the capitalist system itself could be collapsing here, right? You've got protests like that. You've got, kids weren't going into
studying business in college.
Yeah.
No one was getting an
sort of
MBA.
this revolution
Right.
against capitalism, and these CEOs were so terrified that what do? They start investing in Washington and start
Just
realizing
a smart move. I mean, you invest in what your problem is, and they invested in campaign donations, lobbyists. I mean, they needed to have their say in Washington in government regulations and rules, and that's what they did.
And at that era, those CEOs of the mid to late 70s worried about the future of capitalism were earning less than they are now, number one, and the distance between what they were earning and what their mid-range employees were earning was less, meaning in this era, since they invested in Washington, CEOs have been paid stratospherically more, and the distance between themselves and their frontline employees has never been greater, which leads to this income inequality.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that starts happening in that era is we move away from, these sort of manager owners of companies to shareholder owners, right? So managers start to be hyper aware of stock prices, and in order to drive stock prices higher, they've got to do things that aren't necessarily in their long-term interest, but might be in their short-term interest.
And right. We talk about in the book that the Business Roundtable, which is one of the biggest business lobbying organizations in Washington, I think they represent 150 or 200 major company CEOs, changed their recommendations for businesses or their models for businesses and said the goal of a business is to increase shareholder value. That is the goal.
Right.
And that changed everything. And that was the 1970s? Or 1980s? Right around that period.
Yeah. And they also go into, this is an important thing that often gets lost. You talked about the reformers in the Watergate era, making things a little bit more democratic, small d in Congress in terms of distributing power more widely. But also there was this mechanism about funding Congress and political action committees and taking money out of safes and paper bags, meaning cash transactions that nobody could trace, to things that have checks and bank accounts and serial numbers attached to them. It's a little bit more visible, but it's also monetized in a bipartisan way that seemed to work to the net benefit of corporations.
And that was another reform, well-intentioned reform that came out of Watergate. The idea was let's clean up the system. Let's create these things called corporate PACs, political action committees, where companies would essentially pass a hat around the office, raise money from employees, and then donate it to members of Congress. However, starting in the 1970s, the number of PACs exploded from a couple hundred or a couple dozen to thousands and thousands. Importantly, members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who essentially exist to get reelected and need to spend tons of money getting reelected, saw corporate PACs as a great way of funding their campaigns. Mm-hmm. There was a time when about half members of Congress got about half their money from corporate PACs. So what happens when you're getting money from corporate PACs? You're talking to the lobbyists, you're talking to the companies, you're getting to know what they want. And that gives corporate PACs and their lobbyists a big advantage over regular Americans.
So folks, I'm going to give you an opportunity to be really smart at your next cocktail party, dinner party, or talking to your high school teacher or your college professor, because we have a wide demographic range in this show. So either one of you, whoever wants to first, explain who Neil Stabler is. He's the FEC guy who cast the deciding vote to allow for
PACs?
Who's the Sun Oil? Okay, yeah, the FEC decision that legalized PACs, right?
And he was the Democrat who on the FEC lost his position over it for casting it's in the book.
Right.
I'm a very careful reader, gentlemen. I'm a very careful reader. That matters.
Yeah,
it made a huge
in the
difference.
history of all of this.
Well, it was the first legally sanctioned vehicle for corporations to
gather money and then send it to Washington.
And let's go back and get the Dubliner back in this conversation. The way that Democrats raised money before the 1974 era is that Tip O'Neill, the longtime Democratic Speaker of the House from Boston, said that he would go to bars and play cards with people and play poker, and he'd leave a hat or leave a bag, and all of a sudden that bag or hat was full of cash. And that's how you funded your campaign for. And I would say funding your campaign, that could have funded his high school education, his kids' education. Who knows where that money was going? So the PAC system did make things more regulated and more disclosed, which at the time was seen as a good thing.
Who's Tony Coelho and why does he matter?
So Tony Coelho was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Committee in the early 80s. And why he's important was because at that time, Republicans had really gone on the offensive and taken advantage of this sort of this PAC system that was just then coming into being. And what Tony Coelho did was really he was very aggressive about sort of cultivating and soliciting PAC donations from the business community. And
he basically helped get Democrats addicted to campaign cash from companies.
Yeah.
Corporations.
From corporations.
Right.
And through their PACs.
Yeah.
And in the process, over time, diminishing the cloud of labor unions, consumer groups, and environmental groups.
100%.
That's really essentially the story of this book.
Yeah.
More with Luke Mullins and Brody Mullins when we come back to the Dubliner, segment 3 of the Takeout, coming your way in just 1 minute.
Now companies see Washington as a profit center or a way to use lobbyists to hurt competitors and help themselves.
back, continuing our conversation with the authors Brody Mullins and Luke Mullins. Their book, The Wolves of K Street, subtitle, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. So, gentlemen, you know, as well as I do, for the last 10 years or so, there has been a backbeat in American national politics that the whole system is rigged. Is it?
I think it may not be rigged, but companies are the only game in town. Companies are the only people who are.
But, okay, so let's quote Mitt Romney. Companies are people, too.
So we've talked about this, and listen, we don't think...
I'm not saying that's true or not. I'm just quoting Mitt Romney.
But the point is, like, we don't think that lobbying is evil, right? We want the banking
And
industry...
let's remind ourselves, constitutionally protected.
Well,
it's in the First Amendment.
Well, beyond the fact that it's protected, it's healthy, right? We want the banking industry to be talking to regulators and talking to lawmakers about what the banking industry needs. We want them to have a seat at the table.
Or what regulators may have an unintended consequence.
The point is, we want them to have a seat at the table. We don't want them to have the whole table, right? Like, there's not a lot of academic research that gets done on the lobbying industry, but there was a terrific study that came out in 2014. And as part of that study, this researcher talked to something like 75 lobbyists. And among the questions he asked them was, these were all corporate lobbyists. And he said, in the legislative battles that you're fighting right now, who is your top opponent, right? Who are you fighting? Who are your top opponents? Not a single one of those 75 lobbyists mentioned a union, a consumer group, a public interest group. So it's interesting. Like,
they mentioned corporate rivals.
Of course, it's the banking industry is fighting the insurance industry, right? That's or it's Microsoft fighting Google, right? That's what's happening here, right? And I do think it's interesting because I think we all sort of know that corporations are very powerful. I don't think we understand as Americans just how powerful, in the sense that, you know, there really is no one in terms of organized groups going to bat for everyday consumers.
One other point here, I think when people think of lobbying or how Washington works, they think of the government going after companies and companies hiring lobbyists to be on the defensive, to fight off regulations. And that's certainly what started in the 1970s. But now companies see Washington as a profit center, or a way to use lobbyists to hurt competitors and help themselves, as in create regulations that make it harder for
Give my
people
audience an example or two of that.
I'm going to jump in right now with, antitrust is a great example, right? Like, companies that are big, if they want to get bigger, they can only grow through Washington, right? So for many years, we had this very liberal, small L, antitrust regime, right? So if you're Google, you want to buy, some other tech company,
YouTube,
you've got to get approval for it. And for many years, that was not a problem at all. Right?
You got approval, and therefore you grew, and you
that's
got
changing
bigger.
a little bit now.
Right.
So another example is government contracts, right? I mean, that's going out and finding new profits, and in order to do that, lobbyists are a great way to go out and find that source of revenue.
Where does something like the CHIPS Act fall in that, which is industrial policy of a kind and a magnitude that wouldn't even been contemplated in the Obama administration?
Yeah, well, I mean, the premise behind the CHIPS Act is a great one, that this crucial U.S. resource should be made here, so if we're going to war, we still have access to them. The problem is that the money is only going to these enormous U.S. companies that have lobbyists and can afford to get the money.
Right. And so that's another means by which lobbying doesn't necessarily put something into law that doesn't exist. It just funnels something in a very particular direction.
Yeah, this is one of the big transitions that we looked at as well. From the 1970s, where lobbying was used almost as a defensive tactic. You're a bank, you join forces with other banks to, get some regulation that's going to benefit you all. Now it's moved to sort of another way to compete in the marketplace, right? You're using your insider knowledge to either hurt one of your competitors, gain new customers through, say, a government contract, or expand your market share through something like getting through the antitrust regime.
I'm going to sound very college faculty lounge-ish here. Is this industry, corporate lobbying, the last preserve of the white male patriarchy?
We're actually at an event earlier today, and a woman said, "Hey, tell us about the women who are in your book."
I know.
And we said, "Sorry, you're wrong book."
To our great shame.
Heather
Yes.
Podesta.
Heather Podesta is in the book.
makes
yes.
a mention,
Yes.
but it's an industry dominated by white males.
Yeah.
That's
It
how
is.
it is, and so is Congress and the Senate.
Do you think any of the antipathy on the right to diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of that because they don't want those ideas in the corporate world and they don't want that corporate lobbying influence to be changed, or they don't want this power structure to be altered in some sort of way?
I'm not sure. It's interesting that at least what we're seeing on the right now, lobbyists and corporate CEOs have become, really high-profile villains, right? So really attacking certainly this power structure has been, an increasingly sort of politically helpful move.
And still is dominated by white male. This
Yeah,
industry.
I think the lobbying industry is no longer based purely on access, but it started there. And so you have white male senators, House members who hire white male staffers, and those white male staffers become white male lobbyists, and rinse and repeat.
Right, rinse and repeat. Let's do some name checking for my audience's benefit. Who's Tommy Boggs?
So
Why
Tommy-
does he matter?
Tommy Boggs, we consider the original modern lobbyist. He grew up in Washington D.C. His dad was a House member. His dad became the House Majority Leader. In fact, this number 2 House member in Congress. When his dad died, disappeared in a plane crash. The citizens of Louisiana elected his mom to be a member of Congress. She served, I think, for 10 or 12 years. So he grew up in a household where both parents were members of Congress. He became friends with almost all the important people in Washington at a time when, as we discussed, only a few people were important in Washington. So he knew everyone. And after college, after law school, he decided he wanted to become a lobbyist. And because he was so connected with everyone, every big company hired him, and he went to his friends on Capitol Hill and got things done for them.
And got the things done in a way that was not necessarily consistent or maybe diametrically opposed to the ideology and the political impetus of his father and his mother.
It's true. I mean, his father was certainly a very important New Deal Democrat who helped kind of usher in a lot of this sort of, a lot of the kind of regulatory state that came about in the 60s and 70s. And Tommy, went on to as a lobbyist to represent a lot of these companies.
To undermine the same
help sort of roll back, and what's important about Tommy Boggs is that he really comes of age during this period of time where initially in the 1970s, corporations aren't that powerful. And one of the things that he helps do is sort of help individual firms kind of unify and lobby as these broader coalitions where they became much more powerful. And through that tactic, which was fairly novel at the time, he helps sort of lobbyists go from the defensive to the offensive, where the lobbying industry remains throughout the 80s and 90s.
Tony Podesta.
Tony Podesta is one of the most successful Democratic lobbyists of our time. He became a successful lobbyist in part by his connections in Washington, but what he really did was start to move lobbying outside of Washington. What I've realized in my 20 years as a reporter is that a member of Congress will do anything to get reelected, and to get reelected, you have to do what your constituents want. And lobbyists know that, and Tony Podesta knew that. So what Tony Podesta would do is, instead of lobbying directly on Capitol Hill, he would create coalitions, or really presidential campaigns out in the country to get a member of Congress's constituents to support a trade bill or support a tariff or whatnot. Whatever his company wanted, he would try to get the citizens to support that, and then the member of Congress would follow.
And Tony Podesta, his background was perfectly well suited for this. He sort of came up as this brass knuckle liberal activist, and his main tactics was, instead of trying to talk to members of Congress directly, because at that time he didn't have the clout to do that, he had friends in Hollywood, and he was able to generate media attention for the causes he was fighting for, which at that time was the 1980s, and he was fighting against the religious right. And one of his famous successes was he actually helped with the Robert Bork fight in 1987. And he was working with Ted Kennedy to
Robert
whip up
Bork,
support.
nominated to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan.
And he's able to help whip up public support across the country, opposition to Robert Bork. So he learns how to do that as a liberal activist, and then goes into a corporate lobbying role and applies those same tactics.
One of the things that is laced through this book is that lobbying became a political operation and a kind of large conglomerate of various tasks to be performed in one place in Washington, and the most important operators of it became the most powerful players in town. More on that, including references to Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and others when we come back. I'm Major Garrett, segment for The Takeout from The Dubliner in just 1 second.
we ended up with 5 or 4 characters who all had amazing rises in Washington, who became incredibly wealthy, powerful, and influential, and each one of them crashed and burned in their own way.
Welcome back to Takeout. Brody Mullins, Luke Mullins. You might guess they're brothers. Yeah, they're also the authors of The Wolves of K Street. So Paul Manafort figures prominently in this book. Why? Roger Stone and Lee Atwater.
Yeah, Paul Manafort was one of the original big-time Republican lobbyists of the 1980s. You have to remember, in the 1980s, or before the 1980 election, Democrats had run Washington for 40 years. The previous Republican president, Richard Nixon, was obviously left, kicked out of Washington in a disgrace, and all his aides left with him. So all of a sudden, Ronald Reagan wins, and companies needed access to his administration. And no one knew his administration, except for Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and a guy named Charlie Black. They were both 30-year-olds who worked on the Reagan campaign. They had connections to him. So they said, hey, let's start a lobbying firm and start representing companies before the Reagan administration. That model proved to be incredibly successful, and they became the wealthiest lobbyists of that period.
So they would lobby. They would also be political consultants and do more. They would basically do everything.
Yeah, I mean,
in the business of politics.
Their firm, Black, Manafort, and Stone, was sort of one of the first kind of integrated, diversified lobbying shop. And, in their sort of most notorious practice, it became known as this double-breasted operation, where they would get a member of Congress elected. They would run his campaign. Then when they were in Congress, they would turn around and ask them for favors on behalf of their lobbying clients.
Right.
So it was, notorious, but wildly successful also.
And a lot of reckless, testosterone-fueled swagger at that particular firm.
It was the 1980s Washington. I think it was pretty nasty.
Yeah.
And there is a downfall story to almost everyone in this book, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
We tried to pick. We're writing about a pretty weighty topic in campaign money and corporate power and legislation and policy. So we wanted to write about people who are really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. And we ended up with 5 or 4 characters who all had amazing rises in Washington, who became incredibly wealthy, powerful, and influential. And each one of them crashed and burned in their own way. And for us, it was just a good way of telling the story of how Washington works.
Yeah.
You open the book with what can only be described as a cinematic grabber, perfect for any movie or any kind of miniseries, built around a gentleman whose name I did not know, and whose case I did not know, Evan Morris.
So Evan Morris was one of the top pharmaceutical lobbyists in Washington. He was the head of a company called Genentech, which is a big biotech firm. He made a lot of money in lobbying. He was very successful for his company. But the way lobbying has changed, it sort of moved from this smoke-filled room that we talked about in insider deals to more working grassroots campaigns and working with pollsters and trying to shape public opinion. That part of lobbying is not disclosed at all. It's not disclosed to the public, to the government, and in this case, to Evan Morris's company. So it turned out that Evan Morris decided that he could very easily route some of that money back into his own pocket. He started working with a consultant, and they basically started a kickback scheme they ran for 10 years.
For each other.
They each made millions of dollars from this. The problem for Evan Morris is that his company found out about it. And when his company found out about it, he made the decision to end his life.
And he did so where?
Behind the 18th green of the Robert Trent Jones Golf Club, which is this very exclusive golf club in the Virginia suburbs.
Right. I mean, it is one of the apex predator golf clubs in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And he goes there on a Friday. His wife is frantically texting him. He's not responding. He goes, if I remember correctly from the book, that afternoon to buy the gun that he ultimately uses to take his own life. He does so at a fire pit overlooking the 18th green after buying a very expensive bottle of wine. I mean, it's
what's interesting,
almost incomprehensible.
Yeah, it's interesting, Major.
Tragic and gripping and horrifying.
Yeah, many of these stories are, at the end of the day, are tragic. At the end of the day, even a guy like Tommy Boggs. But a lot of things that we're writing about here, lobbying, campaign finance, think tanks. These things are really important and it's things that every American should know about, but they can be dull and a bit tedious to learn about. So that's really one of our goals with this book, was to find people and stories that where the reader could almost not even realize that they were learning these things. That they would, our aspiration was that they would be so compelled by these characters that they would then go learn what they did, which was these
and how they changed lobbying,
Yeah.
and how they made companies so powerful in this era.
There's a phrase that I know both of you have heard. It's not what's illegal in Washington that it's a scandal. It's what's legal.
Right.
Do you believe that to be true?
Absolutely. And there's
What's
only
legal now that shouldn't be, do you think?
Well, a lot of this outside influence peddling, right? It is certainly legal, but the idea that there is no disclosure requirements,
Of what? Be specific.
no disclosure requirements about influence activity aimed at constituents as opposed to a member of Congress, right?
So if you're a lobbyist and you talk to members of Congress or staff to try to influence legislation on behalf of a company, you have to file a semi-annual report saying, I'm so-and-so, I work for this company, this is how much money I make, and this is what this is the policy I'm trying to change. And those are called registered lobbyists. But as we write about, a lot of lobbying is now moved outside of Washington to constituents. As we talked about with Tony Podesta, you're trying to get constituents to support some policy and have those constituents talk to the member of Congress and say, hey, member of Congress, vote for this trade bill or vote against this trade bill. Those lobbyists
So
are
I
not
can stand up something called Louisianans for Better Government.
100%.
And that is a non-disclosable thing where I can pour any amount of money into and prop up billboards, mailers, radio and television and digital advertising for a very specific purpose that only I know about. This is what you're talking about.
That's correct, and there's no disclosure on that. Now, if you pick up the phone and then call the member of Congress, you
Right.
just triggered the disclosure requirement.
Yeah.
So don't call the member of Congress, but do everything you just said. And
But
you
I
don't
mean,
have to
the
disclose.
point is that this approach, this outside approach, where you're trying to get directly to a constituent as opposed to a lawmaker, is actually more effective. As Brody mentioned earlier, lawmakers exist to get reelected, so they will do anything that their voters ask them to do. So the goal of much of K3 these days is to convince lawmakers' voters to put pressure on their member of Congress to do something, to take an action for or against something.
A possibly unanswerable question, but in the minute we have left, Brody and Luke, did any of what we saw on January 6, 2021 reflect what this book is about?
So, I mean, listen, to an extent, certainly, right? We talk about, the actions of corporate lobbyists over 40 years, right? Sort of so much of Washington, the parameters of what was doable in Washington was set by corporate lobbyists over many, many years. And, that did fuel this sort of staggering levels of inequality that we have in this country. And inequality is just such a corrosive effect on communities and democracy.
And when people were screaming as they were on that day, this is our house, Brody?
I think that people...
I'm not saying that's an excuse. Do not misread me, folks. That's not an excuse. I'm just wondering if you think that was some of the fuel to that fire.
I think companies have created a pro-business establishment here, Republicans and Democrats, where people in Washington have it all and get wealthy, then there's the rest of us. And those people are among the January 6th people. They feel like their government's been taken over by big companies, by lobbyists, and the establishment.
The voices of Brody Mullins and Luke Mullins, the book, one more time, The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. Gentlemen, thanks.
Thank you.
And our thanks to Dubliner. Stay tuned for your
Thank
Takeout
you.
Outtake Especial.
We try to write this book that way, right? Just true stories about important subjects that read like novels.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Our thanks to the Dubliner. Always great to be here. Our guest, Brody Mullins, his brother, Luke Mullins. They are the co-authors of The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. Gentlemen, we have 3 threshold questions we ask all of our guests. Our audience loves the questions because they love the answers. So I'll start with you, Luke. Most influential book in your life, all-time favorite movie, and if you're on a long flight or a long drive and you're going to listen to your favorite music, what artist or genre is that most likely to be?
So I would say A Civil Action is probably my all-time favorite book. Although Den of Thieves also was, another one that I just, we try to write this book that way, right? Just, true stories about important subjects that read like novels, right? That's what we were going for. Second question was movie. Oof.
Think of it this way: you're scrolling and you see it, and you stop, even if you know it's halfway done.
So this, I would say Shawshank Redemption. You probably get that a lot.
We do.
But I know, but I'm I could see myself doing that.
Yeah, for good reason.
Yeah.
It's a great movie. It works. Music.
I guess I would say.
Not really music people.
Yeah, I would say U2, I guess.
Okay. Also frequently mentioned. U2 and Springsteen.
Okay.
The most frequently name-checked in the answers to the 3 threshold questions. Brody.
I'm gonna go with Coldplay because I listen to Coldplay when I write. I have always wanted to and would love to get the chance to watch all of the Star Wars in the right chronological order. I mean, that would probably take a flight to Australia, but I could probably get that done.
So you mean 1 through 6?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And my favorite book is What It Takes by Richard Ben Kramer.
Richard
I
Ben
mean,
Kramer,
it's an unbelievable book about the 1988 election, where every single character who was running for president that year had some deep personal flaw, and the way he reported that and wrote it were unbelievable.
Yeah, it is the great book of its time.
That must get name checked here a lot.
Less frequently
Interesting.
than I expect, because I consider it part of the pantheon. And the thing I love
definitely.
most about that book, because I'll never forget it, small personal digression. 1992 was the first presidential convention and the first presidential campaign I covered. I was privileged enough to cover. I remember arriving in Houston, and the book came out then, 4 years after the 88 presidential campaign. Most presidential campaign books are rapidly produced to capture the moment, the zeitgeist, whatever it is. No.
Wow.
Richard Ben Kramer says, no, we're going to
It's-
nail this. We're going to nail it for all time.
Wow.
4 years later, it came out, bestseller, and I think, if not the apex, near the apex of the art form.
Absolutely. And I remember the first 50 pages of that were just about how you moved George W. Bush from his hotel to the convention that year.
Yeah.
Right? All the logistics that went into
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Brody Mullins, Luke Mullins, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
We'll see you next week, folks.